I've spent my career in the analytical side, the business side of the business, doing a lot of financial modeling. And this is a very interesting and unique and frankly very scary problem. We've seen photos like this many times from the stage. And one of the first things that I did was to turn some of this into some of the epidemiological, using some of the epidemiological models that Gary Grove talked about earlier, but basically taking a high density orchard that then transitions into a lesser density orchard, turning that into some mathematics on how the disease is moving through the orchard. Then we think about how the disease is moving through the tree. Garrett Bishop has a wonderful scale that he uses often to describe how severe the disease is and helps us understand how it moves through the tree. And then we think about the individual fruits. And it really comes down to thinking about, if we think about all the fruits in a tree, and all the trees in the orchard, and how many trees are remaining in the orchard, summing all of those up and saying, what's happening to the overall yield in that orchard as a result of the changes in fruit size. And so if we think about the sizing distribution, we have these cherries on the right. These are symptomatic cherries. They've been infected. They're showing obvious symptoms like we've seen so many photos of before. Generally, most of those are going to fall into the undersized category. Either they'll stay on the tree and not fill a bucket and not fill a bin, or if they get harvested, they don't fill a bucket and they don't fill a bin very fast, and then we pay to harvest them, we pay to haul them, we pay to pack them, and then we pay to throw them away. And if we assume that the tree is going to continue producing just as many fruits as it did before, just that some are more are going to fall into the undersized bucket as they become symptomatic, then obviously our yield is decreasing. But then if we also have to allow ourselves to consider what happens as the tree is trying to defend itself from the phytoplasma. What happens to the other asymptomatic fruits on the tree? Are they staying the same size or are they shrinking? We have to allow ourselves to consider that in the model. So we model this to allow the potential shrinkage of asymptomatic fruits during the latency period before symptoms occur. Remember that there's this, say, 3-year period between the time the tree's infected and the time it becomes symptomatic. We put all that together, you put it into this sizing histogram that we so often see in our, that we typically see in our packouts. Keeping when I say we, I was a cherry grower most of my life. I finished my career as a cherry grower. So the last thing I did was I sold all of my interests in my cherry orchard and they cut it down. I'd live a much better retirement if I didn't have those old trees for the last few years of my career. Nonetheless, we see this histogram. We see the size shifting in the gray bar to the far right. Those are those symptomatic fruits that fall into that undersized or 12-row category. And then we also allow for this potential shifting in size. Now we're dealing with a three-dimensional object, a cubic volume. And so when we change the radius of that cubic object 3 ways, we dramatically change how many buckets, how many bins we fill, how much yield we get off of that orchard. In addition, the second thing happens is, and I'll show you this second slide in a second, but this bottom right slide shows what happens to the revenue over time, over, say, a 10-year period, theoretically, using modeling. The revenue and the large size portion of the curve dramatically can drop. And so then we can see the reason for that being that we all well know that the pricing for cherries is heavily dependent on fruit size. We'll get 2.5 times more for a large fruit than we will for a small fruit. And so if we have smaller fruit, we have smaller price in addition to smaller or lesser volume. We also have to consider the individual growers and where they are in the pricing curve in the industry. And each season is different. Each week of the season has a different pricing curve. The directive from Tobin is, let's consider the impact of this disease on the individual grower. We want to make sure that we're making recommendations that are credible to the grower and the grower's financial position. And so a grower in the middle of the season may have a completely different need than the grower, say, in the beginning and the end of the season in terms of pricing. We also know that we have good years and bad years in the cherry business, a lot of volatility. We have to take all of this into account as we're considering financial modeling. We put it together, we get a model that looks like this. So we run these scenario simulations that allow us to consider the course of this disease over time. Here we have on the x-axis 30 years of an orchard's history. And we see epidemiological progression in the yellow of the disease moving through the individual fruits in the orchard and then accumulating through the trees in the orchard, and then, of course, tree to tree throughout the orchard. The gray bars dropping off is the yield dropping off, and then the green line being the profitability. You see this dramatic drop in profitability in an infected orchard in which nothing has been done. Now, these are theoretical models, but it's important to recognize that how fast this profitability can drop after this period where it looks like things are okay for a while. And the reason for this drop-off is the compounding of the loss in revenue. The loss in revenue is compounded because of the loss of yield multiplied by the loss of pricing as the fruit shrinks. We lose both. And so then, to really get after, are these mitigation options that Tobin just talked about, are they cost effective? Is there a return on investment? Some of these things look kind of expensive, at least to me, as a low margin grower in a difficult part of the season. They look a little expensive. So I built this model, one of the more complex financial models I've ever built. But I think cherry farming is complex. I put 79 variables in here to consider the various what-ifs that a grower might come to me about. Well, what about? What about the rate of primary infection of vectors infecting the tree the first time? What about the secondary rate of infection of tree-to-tree spread? What about infection through the roots? What about the efficacy of these various treatments? What if I control the vectors at, say, a 50% efficacy rate? What about a young orchard, an old orchard, an orchard that has fewer years of life in it? What about a coral champagne versus an old Bing, and so forth? What about if the packing house isn't packing 11.5 and 12 row this week? What if I have a good year, a bad year? What if I'm in the middle of the season, the beginning of the season, and so forth? What about various cost structures? I'm tremendously grateful for Karina Gallardo and her work with the enterprise budget models that allows us to use public data for the costing side. So we put all this into this complex model, look at 7 different scenarios, 79 different variables, allowing us to try to get into the ballpark of the grower's business intuition about their financial situation. And then we think, what about the time value of money? We're looking at a long-term investment. As tree fruit growers, we're capital investors in high-risk projects that last a long time. There's a lot of uncertainty that we have to deal with, so we have to think about the time value of money. If someone promises me as a grower a benefit that's going to accrue 10 years in the future, I'm immediately going to think about that benefit being worth about 32 cents today, based on the uncertainty and risk and the value of money. We can't just sum up the profitability years in the future and call it good. So we put in the time value of money into all of this, and we calculate a net present value. These curves are just simple profitability curves. The bottom left looks at the time value of money. Looks like a bowl of spaghetti. I recognize that. Nothing's linear in any of these formulas. And Gary Grove's formula is very consistent with this. The gray line here is the same epidemiologic or the profit curve that results from that the do-nothing curve. That's the do-nothing curve. We're going to see that several more times. The pink curve is if we just remove trees. So if we just remove trees, the profitability of that block can be retained, preserved over time. But then we maybe lose something in the short term, and there's the short-term, long-term trade-off. The purple curve that flattens out suggests that if we remove those trees as soon as we see the symptoms and then replace those trees a year later, we can preserve some profitability. The green line is, the blue line is if we just control vectors using some of these treatments that Tobin just spoke about. Just hypothetically, I'm saying, all right, if we take an expensive treatment, let's say it costs $600 per acre per year and we get 50% efficacy. Kind of taking a conservative approach there. And so we're controlling insects only. We can extend the profitability life of the orchard. The green is we combine everything together. Again, it's pretty consistent with what Gary talked about before. The box in the lower left takes all of these profit curves and discounts them all back to the present time. And I'm going to hit on a couple of points that are interesting in the modeling. Basically, the purpose of this message is to suggest that what we're seeing from the research, the researchers, is a desire to think about the business side of the grower's business and to make recommendations that are cost effective and that have a reasonable return on investment. And secondly, there's all kinds of interesting conversations that come out of this about prioritizing the research and prioritizing the various treatments. One of the observations that's come out of this, and as I've worked through this, is looking at tree removal versus vector control, and the need to work on, or the need to for early detection and treatment. So here I have a little comparison of the rates of the cumulative infection in an orchard for doing nothing and only removing trees. And because of this latency period before the trees become symptomatic, for the first several years, there's no difference between the treatments. It takes several years for that tree removal treatment to really come into effect. It's not to say tree removal isn't effective. It's very effective. It's just that for the first few years, we don't get to see much effect because we haven't, the tree was infected years ago before we finally see the symptoms. And then we see the symptoms, we start removing trees, but we're chasing a problem that occurred 5 years ago. And so the two treatments are not much different for a while. Then if we look at insect control or vector control in the orchard, let's assume that, all right, the disease is in the neighborhood, the vectors are in the neighborhood, and so we monitor them, we find them at the threshold, and we start treating them immediately, we get 50% efficacy. That's an example of a treatment that can occur immediately at the time of infection and thereafter. And so it appears to have this, this dampening effect earlier than tree removal. But then when we put the two of them together, and this is very consistent with what Gary presented in his presentation, we put the two of them together, we get this synergistic effect and can have a dramatic improvement on orchard profitability. So early detection matters, tree removal matters, vector control matters, and all of them bring a positive net present value at these fairly conservative, with these fairly conservative assumptions. Now there's another one. We look at, I identify with this person, with this intuition. I looked at symptomatic fruits in my orchard, and I didn't want to cut those trees down. I only had a couple of years left in the life of that orchard. I didn't want to tell my brother, whose orchard was across the canal, that I had this disease. I just kind of wanted to hide it, and I wanted to keep harvesting that fruit. I hung 9 tons an acre on that Bing orchard in its last year of its life. But I wonder if I should have. And I walk in orchards with Garrett, and I see trees that the grower has flagged 2-3 years ago that still haven't been removed, and I wonder why. what about this idea of delaying tree removal and then continuing to harvest the fruit on the tree for a little while longer? It's pretty tempting. And so I ran some analysis, and I just said, okay, I'm going to just look at if I remove the tree and then replant that same tree a year later. The green line is if I do that promptly. I don't make a delay in removing the tree, and I replant a new tree a year later. Over time, I preserve some profits, and it flattens things out. Remember, I'm not using any vector control at all in here. I'm not treating the insects, so I'm kind of lower on the profitability curves. The orange line is if I just delay that tree removal 1 year. Over time, I'm much less profitable than if I were to remove that tree promptly. It's difficult. It's difficult to do, but then it really becomes obvious if I say, well, what if I delay 2, 3, 4 years? And then we start seeing this down here, this gray line being that same do-nothing curve. And what this says is, if I delay tree removal by 2 years, it's no better than doing nothing at all. And while at the same time, I'm becoming my own worst enemy by allowing that tree-to-tree transmission to occur. So as we consider the economics of this, there are many, many examples of these scenarios that we can run. We've cranked this model many, many different ways, looking at a lot of different scenarios. I've just given you a couple here. But the message being that the conversations that are happening within the halls of the WSU Tree Fruit Research Center are around the business side of the grower's business, very sensitive to bridging the research with the business. We've been having a number of conversations about understanding the differences between growers, that growers are going to make decisions about long-term, high-risk capital investments based on the number of periods they have remaining to collect benefits in that orchard. An orchard like mine, an old orchard like mine that only has a few years left of its life, I may make completely different decisions than someone who has a young orchard with high profitability and a long time left to collect benefits from various mitigation recommendations. The baseline profitability of an orchard it makes a huge difference. So we see that there's tremendous robustness toward an orchard's ability to withstand disease pressure if it's a high profit orchard. And as a result, if we look at that, if an orchard with high baseline profitability, we should just be throwing everything at it as early as we can throw at it to preserve the value of that orchard. The degree of adversity, the efficacy of the mitigation treatment, those obviously go into the consideration. The scale of the mitigation investment certainly plays a big role. The amount of risk and uncertainty in the business environment, as well as in the grower's confidence in the efficacy of the treatment or the expected efficacy of the treatment. Each grower also can have a completely different level of risk tolerance, and that factors into the equation. The cost of capital, especially now with higher interest rates, is a big deal with the future cost of money dealing with long-term time horizons. If I'm thinking about planting an orchard today, at these high interest rates, and I'm thinking about protecting that orchard from infection, I'm looking at a 30-year time horizon for the life of that investment. The cost of capital is going to play a big factor in the decisions that I make. And also, obviously, the time in the future when those benefits are achieved. These conversations are being had. I'm grateful to be invited to participate. This is probably the last string that I have to clip in my career. We're still holding on here for a little while, but mostly I talk about grandchildren and basketball these days. But this project is a worthy project for me to be involved in financial analysis, because these are the scariest financial numbers that I have ever run in my career. Thank you.